Thanksgiving. The word alone stirs up images of golden brown turkeys, steaming bowls of mashed potatoes, and the sound of laughter echoing through homes. It's a time of tradition, where families and friends gather around the dinner table, sharing stories, gratitude, and if you're lucky, that one relative's questionable casserole. Thanksgiving is often hailed as the ultimate celebration of togetherness, a day to pause and reflect on what we're grateful for. For many, it's the warm glow of love and comfort. But let's be real, holidays aren't picture perfect for everyone. For some, Thanksgiving is more about awkward family feuds, burned pies, and dodging that one nosy aunt who just has to ask why you're still single. And then there's the darker side of the holiday. Beneath the facade of togetherness and joy, tensions simmer, secrets unravel, and sometimes things take a chilling turn. While most of us are arguing over the last slice of pumpkin pie, others find themselves caught in nightmares they never saw coming. Today, we're diving into some of those stories, tales of Thanksgiving celebrations that ended in tragedy. These aren't your typical holiday dramas. These are the kind of stories that make you think twice about what's really happening behind closed doors. So grab your plate of leftovers and settle in, because this episode is taking Thanksgiving to a place you never expected. Let's talk about the crimes, the mysteries, and the horrors that have marked this day of gratitude with anything but joy. Since Thanksgiving is upon us, I thought it'd be the perfect time to dive into a chilling true crime story tied to this holiday. A story so horrific and unexpected that it feels like the plot of a dark thriller. But sadly, this is no fiction. It's the story of Seth Privacki and a brutal family massacre that forever stained Thanksgiving in 1998. Let's rewind to that day, November 29th. It started like any other holiday, families coming together, sharing food, laughter, and warmth. For 19-year-old April Boss, the day was no different. She went over to her boyfriend Jedediah Privacki's house for a Thanksgiving meal with his family. They had planned a delayed celebration that Sunday, but as the hours stretched into the night, April's parents began to worry. They hadn't heard from her, and she wasn't answering her phone. Around midnight, uneasy and desperate for answers, they decided to drive over to the Privacki home. Imagine their dread as they pulled into the driveway. Cars sat eerily parked outside, but the house was silent. No lights, no sounds, no sign of life. Then they spotted something that sent a jolt of fear through their hearts. A shadowy figure darted into the house and then quickly out again. But even more horrifying, there were bloodstains on the driveway. And then they saw it, a lifeless body. That moment must have felt like stepping into a nightmare. Panicked and trembling, they called the police, who arrived within minutes. Officers checked the body. It was clear the person was dead. Fearing the killer might still be inside, they surrounded the house and waited. While securing the scene, one officer spotted a figure lurking in the woods nearby. That's when they arrested 18-year-old Stephen Wallace. At first, he seemed like a suspect, but he quickly confessed that his best friend, Seth Privacki, was the real perpetrator. With Stephen's cooperation, the police finally entered the house, and nothing could have prepared them for what they found. Inside the Privacki home, the officers were met with absolute carnage. Blood spattered the walls, and bodies were scattered throughout the house. Every room told a gruesome story. In total, they found 5 victims: Stephen and Linda Privacki, both in their late 40s, their elder son Jedediah, just 19 years old, Jed's girlfriend April, and Seth's grandfather, 78-year-old John Privacki. The youngest son, Seth, was nowhere to be found. The following morning, a manhunt was launched for 18-year-old Seth. His high school was placed on lockdown, and his photo was plastered all over the news. Meanwhile, people were still reeling from the unthinkable. The Privackis were a well-respected family, known for their kindness and close-knit bond. How could something so horrific happen? Here's where the story takes an almost surreal turn. While the police searched for Seth, a teenager named Gianna Simonelli was driving around town, shaken by the news. As she drove, she noticed a drenched hitchhiker on the side of the road. Feeling sorry for him, she stopped and offered him a ride. Now I know what you're thinking. No, Gianna, don't do it. But she didn't realize it was Seth Privacki until he was already in the car. Can you imagine her terror stuck in a car with a mass murderer? But here's the incredible part. Jana kept her cool. Pretending she didn't recognize him, she dropped him off at a friend's house and immediately called the police. By the end of the day, Seth was caught, hiding in a barn just a mile from his home. When arrested, he stayed completely silent, only requesting a lawyer. Now, let's dive into the big question, why? Why would an 18-year-old described as quiet and kind do something so monstrous? Even now, we don't have all the answers, but here's what we do know. Seth Privacki was born on June 2, 1980, in Michigan. He was the younger of two brothers in what seemed like a normal, loving family. His father, Stephen, was a well-liked fifth-grade teacher with 25 years of experience. His mother, Linda, worked as a receptionist at a medical office. They lived near Seth's grandfather, John, and were close-knit, at least on the surface. Seth, however, felt differently. In the months leading up to the murders, he became increasingly unhappy and withdrawn. He said he felt isolated and misunderstood. According to him, his father was often critical, and their arguments had escalated to the point where his dad threatened to kick him out of the house. He also claimed his mother and brother, once his allies, started siding with his dad. On that fateful Sunday, tensions boiled over. After a brief argument with his father, Stephen told Seth he needed to move out. That's when Seth snapped. While his dad went to pick up his grandfather, Seth loaded his father's .22 caliber Ruger and waited. One by one, he executed his entire family. First, his brother Jedediah, shot in the back of the head while watching TV. Then his father and grandfather ambushed in the garage. His mother Linda was killed as she stepped out of the shower. Finally, April Boss, who had arrived unexpectedly, was also shot. Each victim was killed with a single shot to the head, except for his grandfather, who was shot twice. Seth later claimed he had no intention of killing April, but his actions that day tell a different story. After the murders, Seth called his best friend, Stephen Wallace, for help cleaning up the scene. Stephen, who later claimed he acted out of fear, helped Seth wrap the bodies in sheets and attempt to stage the house to look like a robbery. But before they could finish, April's parents arrived, forcing the two to flee. In court, Seth admitted to the killings but gave little insight into his motives. At one point, he said, "I never thought about killing my parents until that morning. It was all a mistake. I wish I could take it back." But this was contradicted by evidence showing he had tried to purchase ammunition the night before. Seth was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Over the years, he tried to explain his actions, blaming everything from drugs to his agnostic upbringing. But none of it really adds up, does it? The story ends in yet another shocking twist. On July 15, 2010, Seth attempted to escape from prison with two other inmates. They hijacked a semi-truck and tried to ram it through the prison fence. When the truck got stuck, Seth made a run for it, ignoring orders to stop. A corrections officer opened fire, killing him on the spot. And just like that, the story of Seth Privacki came to a violent end. But the pain he caused lives on. That fatal Thanksgiving Day back in 1998 was supposed to be a day of gratitude and togetherness, a holiday celebrating family. Instead, 5 lives were stolen and countless others were shattered. Hey, sorry for the quick interruption, but if you enjoy these stories, it would help me out a lot. If you smash that like button, it helps to push these videos out. If you subscribe, that would be great. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and if there's any stories you would like me to cover. Right, back to the story. So Thanksgiving is supposed to be a day of gratitude, a time when families come together to celebrate love, life, and togetherness. It's a time for shared meals, laughter, and, let's be honest, sometimes awkward conversations with relatives you only see once or twice a year. Most of us have been there. Political debates with that one uncle who just won't let it go, or the cousin who brings up that embarrassing thing you did 5 years ago in front of the whole family. Usually those squabbles blow over, and by the end of the night, everyone's swapping leftovers and saying, "See you next year." But sometimes, family tensions simmer beneath the surface, unspoken and unresolved. And in rare, tragic cases, those tensions explode in unimaginable ways. That's exactly what happened to the Sitton family in 2009. a Thanksgiving celebration that turned into a nightmare they could never escape. Thanksgiving Day in Jupiter, Florida, started like any other. Muriel and Jim Sitton were hosting dinner for 16 of their closest family members at their beautiful upscale home. Among the guests were Muriel's parents, 79-year-old Ramon Joseph and her husband, Muriel's nieces, Lisa Knight and Carla Merhige, both 33 years old, Lisa's husband Patrick, and the Sittons' 6-year-old daughter, Michaela. It was the kind of gathering you'd see in a Hallmark movie. Food, family, and the kind of festive atmosphere that warms your soul. But beneath the surface, there was one name that cast a shadow over the evening: Paul Merhige, the 35-year-old estranged son of Michael Merhige, Muriel's brother. Paul hadn't been a part of the family's Thanksgiving celebrations for years, and for good reason. His history with his family was complicated. No, scratch that, toxic. Paul had once been a golden child. A straight-A student with dreams of becoming a doctor, he seemed destined for greatness. But somewhere along the way, things went terribly wrong. By the time he turned 20, Paul's life had unraveled. He suffered from severe mental health issues, including bouts of violent rage and emotional instability that made it impossible for him to hold down a job or maintain healthy relationships. Over the years, Paul became more and more isolated, spiraling into paranoia and anger. He blamed everyone else, especially his two sisters, Lisa and Carla, for his failures. His resentment toward them grew so intense that Lisa once filed a restraining order against him, though it was later dropped. By his mid-30s, Paul was entirely dependent on his parents, who had bought him a condo just to get him out of their house. Even then, they had to hire someone to monitor whether he was taking his medication. Paul's violent outbursts weren't just a vague concern, they were a recurring reality. Police had been called to his parents' home numerous times over the years, and he had been involuntarily committed to psychiatric facilities on 3 occasions. Yet despite all of these red flags, Paul's father, Michael, decided to invite him to Thanksgiving dinner. Without consulting anyone else, he gave Paul directions to the Sittons' house. When Muriel found out her nephew was on his way, she reportedly turned to her sister Lisa and jokingly said, "I hope he doesn't kill us all." It was a dark comment meant in jest, but tragically, it would prove to be horrifyingly prophetic. When Paul arrived, everyone braced themselves. But to their surprise, things seemed fine. He joined the family for dinner, engaged in conversation, and even watched as Carla played the piano while the family sang Christmas carols. Little Michaela, the Sittons' only child, stole the spotlight with a dance she was rehearsing for a performance the next day. For a brief moment, it seemed like Paul had left his demons at the door. But what the family didn't know was that Paul had been planning this massacre for weeks. He had withdrawn $12,000 from a savings account his parents had set up for him and spent part of it purchasing guns and ammunition. In his mind, this wasn't just a spontaneous outburst. It was premeditated. After Michaela went to bed, Paul quietly excused himself and walked out to his car. When he returned, he was armed with a handgun. Without warning, he opened fire. Paul's first victim was his 79-year-old Aunt Ramond, who died instantly. Next, he turned his gun on his sisters, Carla and Lisa, fatally shooting both of them. As Lisa's husband, Patrick, rushed to her side, Paul shot him as well. Patrick survived, but he spent the next 3 months in a medically induced coma. By now, the other family members had scattered in terror, some hiding in the kitchen while Jim and Muriel frantically called 911. But Paul wasn't done. He made his way down the hallway to Michaela's room, where the little girl lay sleeping. He fired 3 shots, killing her just days before her 7th birthday. As he walked back through the house, Paul coldly remarked, "I've been waiting 20 years to do this," before getting into his car and driving away. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but its effects shattered the Sitton family forever. 4 people were dead, and Patrick Knight was critically injured. The survivors were left to grapple with their grief, trauma, and the horrifying question of how this could have been prevented. Law enforcement launched a manhunt for Paul, who fled the scene in a blue Toyota Camry. For a month, he eluded capture. A $100,000 reward was offered for information, and the case was featured on America's Most Wanted. That broadcast proved to be the break authorities needed. A motel owner in Long Key, Florida, recognized Paul from the show and tipped off the FBI. On January 2, 2010, federal agents arrested him in his motel room. Paul had shaved his head in an attempt to disguise himself, but there was no mistaking him. Paul was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. But in 2011, just weeks before his trial was set to begin, Paul accepted a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty and waiving his right to appeal, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Paul was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The plea deal sparked mixed reactions. Jim and Muriel Sitton, who had lost their beloved Michaela, were devastated. They had prepared themselves for a trial and wanted Paul to face the ultimate punishment. Others, like Patrick Knight, felt differently. After losing his wife and enduring months of physical recovery, he supported the plea deal, hoping it would bring closure. In the years since the massacre, the Sitton and Merhija families have been irreparably fractured. Jim and Muriel filed a civil suit against Paul's parents, accusing them of negligence for inviting him to Thanksgiving. The case was ultimately dismissed, but the emotional scars remain. Paul Merhija now sits in a Florida prison where he will spend the rest of his life. For the surviving family members, the pain of that night will never fully fade. The memories of love and laughter have been overshadowed by the haunting loss of those they held most dear. Thanksgiving will never be the same for them or for anyone who hears their story. This story was really sad to research, as are many others. But to take the life of a 6-year-old girl is just soul-destroying. I can't even begin to imagine how those parents felt, still feel. It is every parent's worst nightmare. I would have wanted the death sentence too, so I could understand their disappointment in the plea deal. But I also feel death is too easy. At least he will die in prison and never be released. I only hope they can take some comfort in that. Thanksgiving is a time for family, a time to gather, give thanks, and celebrate the bonds that tie us together. For the Guy family of Knoxville, Tennessee, Thanksgiving 2016 was particularly poignant. Lisa and Joel Guy Sr., the family's matriarch and patriarch, had decided it was time to retire after decades of hard work. They were ready to sell their suburban Knoxville home, move closer to family in Surgoinsville, and finally enjoy a simpler, quieter life. But what should have been the start of a new chapter turned into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. Joel and Lisa had been married for 31 years, blending their lives into a family that included Joel Sr.'s 3 children from a previous marriage and their youngest, Joel Michael Guy Jr. Despite the typical challenges of raising a blended family, Joel and Lisa worked hard to provide for their children. They were the epitome of the American dream: stable jobs, a nice home, and dreams for a secure retirement. But like many families, their unity was tested by complex dynamics. Joel Guy Jr., the youngest of the family, stood out from his siblings in more ways than one. While his older half-sisters and half-brother built lives of independence, Joel Jr. remained a stark contrast, reclusive, dependent, and as many would later say, deeply out of touch with reality. At 28 years old, he had spent much of his adult life as a perpetual student at Louisiana State University. Despite being enrolled for years, he had no degree to show for it and had never held down a job. Instead, he relied entirely on his parents, who funded his apartment, utilities, and other expenses, an arrangement that created resentment among his siblings, though they rarely expressed it openly. The decision to cut Joel Jr. off financially came as a shock to him, but for Joel Sr. and Lisa, it was necessary. After years of enabling their youngest son, they saw their impending retirement as a time to let go of their financial obligations. What they didn't see was how deeply their decision had affected Joel Jr. He didn't complain, didn't argue, at least not directly, but inside he was stewing, plotting, and preparing for the unthinkable. The Guy family's Thanksgiving in 2016 was supposed to be one of their last in the Knoxville home. Joel Sr. and Lisa hosted their children and grandchildren for a traditional dinner. The air was filled with the warmth of shared memories, but looking back, there were subtle cracks in the surface. Joel Jr.'s presence was particularly surprising. He hadn't announced that he'd be making the long drive from Baton Rouge to Knoxville, and for someone who was usually distant, his sudden effort to engage with family was unusual. Joel Jr. spent the weekend reconnecting with his nieces and nephews, giving away childhood toys and making small talk. His half-siblings, though polite, couldn't help but find his behavior odd. Joel Jr. was never the sentimental type, and his attempts at generosity felt hollow. But no one voiced their concerns. After all, Thanksgiving is about togetherness, not airing grievances. Beneath Joel Jr.'s calm exterior, however, his mind was working overtime. Unknown to anyone else, he had meticulously planned the events that were about to unfold. A notebook later found in his possession revealed his chilling intent: kill his parents, stage the crime to look like a domestic dispute, and use chemical means to dispose of their bodies. He had calculated everything, from the amount of corrosive chemicals needed to dissolve human tissue to the exact temperature required to expedite decomposition. On Saturday, November 26, Joel Jr. put his plan into action. Lisa had gone out to shop for groceries, leaving Joel Sr. alone in the house with his son. It was then that Joel Jr. struck. In the upstairs exercise room, a violent struggle erupted. Joel Sr., who was 61 years old and recovering from surgery, fought valiantly to defend himself. Evidence of the fight was everywhere: the overturned Bowflex machine, blood spatter on the walls, and damage to the blinds. But ultimately, Joel Jr.'s youth and rage overpowered his father. He stabbed him over 40 times, each wound a grotesque expression of his pent-up fury. When Lisa returned home, she barely had time to put the groceries down before Joel Jr. attacked her as well. He stabbed her with such ferocity that 9 of her ribs were severed. The assault was gruesome, methodical, and deeply personal. It was clear Joel Jr. didn't just want his parents dead, he wanted to obliterate them. What followed was a scene straight out of a horror movie. Joel Jr. began dismembering his parents' bodies, cutting their arms, legs, and torsos into manageable pieces. He placed the body parts in large plastic bins filled with corrosive chemicals, intending to dissolve them completely. Lisa's head was severed and placed in a pot on the stove, which he left simmering. The air in the house became thick with the sickly smell of decomposition and chemicals, a horrifying testament to the sheer brutality of the act. Joel Jr. had brought everything he needed to execute his plan, from industrial-strength cleaning supplies to tools for dismemberment. But in his frenzy, he made crucial mistakes. He injured himself during the attack, leaving his own blood at the scene. Surveillance footage from a local Walmart later showed him purchasing medical supplies to treat his wounds, his hands heavily bandaged. By Monday, Lisa's coworkers became alarmed when she didn't show up for work. She was retiring in just a few days, and her absence was highly unusual. Concerned, they contacted the police for a welfare check. When officers arrived at the Guy home, the scene that greeted them was beyond comprehension. The front door was unlocked, and the house was eerily quiet. Inside, the heat was stifling, likely due to the chemical reactions taking place upstairs. In the master bathroom, investigators found the dismembered remains of Joel Sr. and Lisa. The tubs of corrosive chemicals were still bubbling, and Lisa's head was simmering on the stove. Blood covered the walls and floors, a chilling reminder of the violence that had taken place. For Joel Jr.'s siblings, the discovery was devastating. Not only had they lost their father and beloved stepmother in the most horrific way imaginable, but they also had to grapple with the fact that their youngest brother, a man they had shared holidays and childhood memories with, was responsible. His half-sister Michelle later described feeling a mix of grief and disbelief, saying, "We knew he was odd, but we never thought he was capable of this." During Joel Jr.'s trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence in harrowing detail. The jury was shown his notebook, which outlined his plan step by step, as well as the surveillance footage of his Walmart trip. Despite his attempts to appear emotionless, the sheer weight of the evidence made it clear this was a premeditated, calculated crime. Joel Jr. showed no remorse throughout the proceedings. His siblings sat in stunned silence as the gruesome details of their father and stepmother's murders were recounted. In the end, Joel Jr. was convicted on all charges, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the Guy family, the pain of Joel Jr.'s actions is immeasurable. His half-siblings have spoken about the deep betrayal they feel, not only for the loss of their father and Lisa, but for the realization that someone they shared their lives with was capable of such evil. Joel Jr.'s crimes left scars that will never fully heal, a dark legacy that overshadows the memory of a once loving family. I can't even begin to imagine how on earth you would get over something like this. Honestly, the brutality in which he took his own parents' lives is just harrowing. Just days from retiring and about to enjoy their freedom, and your own son does this to you. So evil. I would haunt him for the rest of his days. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hug and love you family this Thanksgiving. It was a chilly afternoon on November 23, 2006, when Memphis Rescue Services received a call at 3:46 p.m. Now, it's no secret that emergencies don't take holidays, but even seasoned dispatchers are sometimes caught off guard. The operator who answered that day was stunned, not by the situation itself, but by the unsettling calm of the caller. The man on the line introduced himself as Jeffrey Scott. His tone was flat, almost robotic, as he explained that his wife, Ashley, had been unconscious since 11 a.m. But before the dispatcher could even process that, another voice in the background interjected, "She's probably already dead." The dispatcher pressed for clarification. Jeffrey then casually remarked, "She was breathing a second ago," with the same emotion you'd use to discuss the weather. It was enough to send alarm bells ringing in the operator's mind. Something about this call wasn't right. Emergency services and law enforcement rushed to the address Jeffrey provided. When officers arrived, Jeffrey met them at the door and led them to the bedroom where his wife, Ashley Scott, lay lifeless on the bed. A man hovered over her, attempting resuscitation. He introduced himself as Dr. Robert McGee, a family friend. McGee informed the responders that Ashley was still alive, but barely clinging to life, with extremely low blood pressure and shallow breaths. The responding medics quickly assessed the situation and found Ashley's condition critical. She was bleeding from her nose and mouth, her pupils were dilated and unresponsive to light, and her body bore the telltale signs of violence. Bruises and abrasions covered her chest, legs, and back. Despite their best efforts, the team couldn't revive her. They rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. By the time she arrived, Ashley was in the final stages of brain death. At just 28 years old, her life was slipping away. The decision was made to remove her from life support. Ashley Scott was gone. Doctors and investigators didn't need much time to figure out that Ashley's injuries were not the result of an accident. Her right ear was bruised, a mark often seen in cases of repeated trauma, like a boxer enduring countless punches. There was even an imprint of a man's shoe on her back, a haunting detail that spoke volumes about the violence she endured. Further examination revealed bruises in various stages of healing, indicating that this wasn't a one-time incident. Ashley had been suffering for a long time. As the investigation began, Jeffrey Scott's behavior continued to raise suspicions. He told officers that he and Ashley had been drinking the night before, had an argument, and she went to bed, but didn't wake up the next morning. According to him, it was Dr. McGee who convinced him to call 911 after finding Ashley unresponsive. But detectives weren't buying Jeffrey's story. The evidence in the home painted a different picture. The house was in disarray, with signs of a struggle in nearly every room. Furniture was overturned, a vase lay shattered on the floor, and printed messages between Ashley and another man were found on the kitchen table. Messages that confirmed Ashley had been having an affair. In the garage, officers made an even more chilling discovery. Bloodstains on the floor of Ashley's car, along with her belongings, including a purse containing her passport and other personal documents. It seemed Ashley had been planning to leave. She had packed, she was ready, but she didn't get the chance. To understand what led to this tragedy, investigators began speaking with Ashley's friends and family. What they uncovered painted a harrowing picture of a young woman trapped in an abusive relationship. Born Ashley Pittman on November 4, 1978, in Bossier City, Louisiana, Ashley had a tough childhood. Her parents divorced when she was young, and though her father, Jimmy Pittman, adored her, the instability of her early years left its mark. Despite these challenges, Ashley grew into a kind and ambitious young woman. She graduated high school in 1996 and enrolled at Baptist University in Arkansas, where she met Jeffrey Scott. At first, Jeffrey seemed like a dream come true. Handsome, charming, and ambitious, he swept Ashley off her feet. They married in 2001, and Ashley's friends envied her seemingly perfect life. But behind closed doors, Jeffrey's true nature began to show. Over the years, Jeffrey became controlling and emotionally abusive, isolating Ashley from her family and friends. She stopped reaching out, withdrew from social events, and kept her struggles hidden. To the outside world, she was a dedicated English teacher, beloved by her students and colleagues. But at home, she was trapped in a toxic and dangerous marriage. By September 2006, Ashley had reached her breaking point. She had secretly contacted a divorce lawyer and began making plans to leave Jeffrey. Friends like Lori, who had reconnected with Ashley after years of estrangement, noticed her growing fear and anxiety. Lori recalled that Ashley hinted at the abuse but was too afraid to fully open up. Then, Ashley met Michael Lowe. The two began a whirlwind romance, exchanging messages that gave Ashley hope for a better future. Michael encouraged her to leave Jeffrey and promised to support her. But when Jeffrey discovered the messages, his anger boiled over. The night before Ashley's death, Jeffrey confronted her with printouts of the messages. What followed was a violent, brutal attack that ended in Ashley's death. She spent her final hours lying on the cold garage floor, bleeding and unconscious, while Jeffrey waited hours before seeking help. Jeffrey Scott's trial began in January 2009. The prosecution argued that this was a premeditated murder, pointing to the clear evidence of prolonged abuse and the violent struggle that occurred in the Scott home. Ashley's divorce lawyer testified, revealing that Ashley had been ready to leave but wanted to speak with Jeffrey one last time. A decision that proved fatal. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the jury found Jeffrey guilty of second-degree murder, not first-degree. He was sentenced to just 20 years in prison with no possibility of parole. For Ashley's family, the verdict was a devastating blow. In the wake of Ashley's death, her father, Jimmy, channeled his grief into action. He established a charitable foundation in Ashley's memory, providing support and resources to victims of domestic violence. The foundation has since helped hundreds of women escape abusive relationships and rebuild their lives, ensuring that Ashley's story continues to inspire hope and change. Ashley Scott's life was cut tragically short, but her story serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of domestic violence. Her bravery, her resilience, and her determination to escape will never be forgotten. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, know that help is out there. Ashley's story, though heartbreaking, is also a beacon of hope for those who feel trapped. Let her legacy remind us all to fight for justice and support those in need. So let's dive into a case that's as gruesome as it is unbelievable. A story of abuse, manipulation, and cannibalism. Yes, you heard that right. This is the story of Omaima Ari Nelson, a woman whose turbulent beginnings led her down a path of violence so shocking it made headlines worldwide, and it all came to a head during the Thanksgiving weekend of 1991. So grab your popcorn, or maybe not for this one. Let's get into it. Omaima Ari Nelson was born in 1968 in a small, impoverished village near the Sudanese border in southern Egypt. Her childhood was a nightmare of suffering. Raised in a household ruled by violence, Omaima's father was abusive in every sense of the word, physically, emotionally, and even sexually tormenting his wife and children. But one event from Omaima's childhood stands out as particularly horrific. At the age of 7, she was forced to undergo female genital mutilation, or FGM. For those who aren't familiar, FGM is a barbaric practice performed to control a woman's sexuality, often using crude tools and without any anesthesia. For Omaima, this traumatic ordeal left lifelong scars, both physical and emotional. It made intimacy agonizing and planted the seeds of trauma that would haunt her throughout her life. Eventually, her mother found the courage to leave Omaima's father, and the family relocated to Cairo. They ended up in the City of the Dead, a sprawling slum built among the graves of Cairo's ancient cemetery. Despite the morbid name, this area had become a haven for Cairo's poorest, with entire families living among tombstones. Life there was bleak and filled with hardship, but Omaima grew into a striking young woman, physically stunning, with sharp features that would later become her ticket out of the slums. At 18, Omaima met an older American oil worker who promised her a better life in the United States. With her family's encouragement, she married him in 1986 and moved to Texas. But the American dream turned out to be anything but dreamy. The marriage fell apart quickly, for reasons that remain unclear, and Omaima found herself stranded, alone in a foreign country, with little money, no marketable skills, and limited English. Desperate to survive, Omaima turned to her looks. She bounced between jobs as a nanny, maid, and even a part-time model. But these gigs weren't enough to pay the bills, and soon Omaima found herself drifting into darker territory. She began targeting older, wealthy men, using her beauty to manipulate and eventually rob them. Her methods grew increasingly violent. According to one ex-boyfriend, Robert Hansen, Omaima tied him to a chair, pulled out a shotgun, and demanded money. Thankfully, he managed to escape, but the encounter left him shaken. Omaima was becoming more dangerous, moving from man to man, town to town, leaving a trail of theft and terror in her wake. In 1991, at the age of 23, Omaima ended up in Orange County, California, where she met her ultimate target, William Bill Nelson. Bill was 56 years old, a towering Texan at 6'4" and 230 pounds, with a larger-than-life personality to match. A former pilot, Bill had served time in federal prison for smuggling drugs and electronics across the Mexican border. But despite his criminal past, he was described by friends and family as a generally good guy, charismatic, generous, and always ready with a joke. Omaima and Bill's relationship moved fast, dangerously fast. They met at a bar, and within a month, they were married. Their wedding was a casual affair, first officiated over the phone by an Egyptian priest, and later made official at a courthouse in Phoenix. From there, they embarked on a whirlwind honeymoon road trip through Texas and Arkansas. Bill introduced Omaima to his family during this trip, and while they found her tough and no-nonsense, they had no idea just how dangerous she really was. By the time they returned to Bill's Costa Mesa apartment in California, the honeymoon phase was over, literally and figuratively. Bill Nelson called his daughter Margaret shortly before Thanksgiving to invite her to dinner with him and Omaima. Margaret declined, and that was the last time she ever heard her father's voice. On December 1st, 1991, Omaima showed up at the home of an ex-boyfriend, Jose Esquivel, in the early hours of the morning. She was hysterical, covered in cuts, and claimed her husband had been abusing her for days. She told Jose she'd killed Bill in self-defense, dismembered his body, and needed help disposing of it. Omaima offered Jose $75,000 and 2 motorcycles in exchange for his help. Jose wisely told her to wait while he got his truck. Instead, he called 911. When police arrived at Bill Nelson's apartment, they found a scene straight out of a horror movie. The bedroom was soaked in blood, with broken furniture and signs of a violent struggle. In the bathroom, they discovered Bill's torso, skinned and hanging from coat hangers over the bathtub. In the kitchen, things were even worse. Bill's hands were found frying in a pan, cooked alongside pieces of Thanksgiving turkey. His head was in the freezer, wrapped in tin foil and deep-fried. Investigators also found trash bags filled with dismembered body parts, and a garbage disposal clogged with human flesh. In total, Bill's body was missing over 100 pounds of flesh and bone. Neighbors reported hearing the garbage disposal running non-stop over the weekend until it broke. And chillingly, Omaima later claimed she had prepared Bill's ribs in a restaurant-style manner, describing them as sweet. She also hinted at making stew from his tongue and soup from his eyes. Omaima was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During the trial, her defense team attempted to frame her as a victim of lifelong abuse. They argued that she suffered from severe PTSD due to years of trauma, claiming that Bill had physically and sexually assaulted her during their brief marriage. Omaima even alleged that he once threw her cat out of a moving car, painting a picture of a volatile and dangerous relationship. But the evidence presented in court was damning. Bill's injuries told a story of overkill. He had been stabbed more than 25 times. Forensic experts testified that much of the dismemberment and mutilation occurred after he was already dead, undermining any claims of self-defense. Witnesses also recalled Omaima's bizarre and chilling behavior in the aftermath, including her alleged offer to pay for help in disposing of Bill's remains and her confession about eating parts of his body. The most emotional testimony came from Bill's daughter, Margaret, who described the devastating impact of her father's murder. Margaret, who had been close to her father, was in court to face the woman who had not only taken his life but also desecrated his body in ways almost too gruesome to comprehend. She shared her pain and disbelief, speaking about how her father had trusted Omaima and truly wanted to help her. Margaret's heartbreak was palpable as she expressed how this crime had robbed her of her sense of safety and trust in others. She painted a picture of Bill as a kind and generous man who didn't deserve such a brutal end. In 1993, the jury found Omaima guilty of second-degree murder, a slightly reduced charge. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. Omaima's life behind bars took a strange turn when, during her incarceration, she married a much older man in his 70s. This wealthy individual reportedly visited her regularly for conjugal visits, some lasting up to 3 days at a time. When questioned, the man claimed he never felt nervous or afraid of Omaima, a statement that baffled many given the brutality of her crime. After his death, Omaima inherited a substantial sum of money from him. While the exact amount remains unclear, reports suggest it was enough to ensure her financial stability even behind bars, a deeply ironic twist considering her violent history. To this day, Omaima continues to seek parole, though she has been denied multiple times, most recently in 2011. Her next parole meeting will be in 2026. Parole boards have consistently cited her lack of remorse and the extreme violence of her crime as reasons to keep her incarcerated. For the family of Bill Nelson, including Margaret, Omaima's continued attempts at freedom serve as painful reminders of a loss they'll never truly overcome. Omaima Nelson's story is one of the most chilling examples of how a lifetime of abuse and trauma can twist a person's psyche. Was she a victim lashing out in self-defense, or a cold-blooded predator who saw her husband as nothing more than her next meal? Perhaps it's a little of both. Either way, her story is one that will haunt you long after the credits roll. Thanks for listening to Thanksgiving Horrors with Midnight, Murder, and Mystery. If you enjoyed this episode, or if it kept you up at night, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, stay safe, and maybe skip the ribs at your next Thanksgiving dinner. Good night and sweet dreams.